I'm excited to finally announce the Freaky Folklore Compendium. Carmen Carrion and I are working with ChloeL Publishing to put together a terrifying, beautifully illustrated encyclopedia which explains the history and lore of your favorite folklore monsters, along with creepy short stories about what might happen if you were to encounter such creatures. Pre-order the book today on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your favorite bookstore. Plus, the first 100 folks who pre-order will get a free exclusive Folklore Freak t-shirt and a Cryptid card game dual set prototype. You can't even get Cryptid anywhere else at the moment. Search for Freaky Folklore, a compendium of the world's most frightening monsters, cryptids, and beasts, or use the links in the description. Please see the links below for rules, information, and how to redeem your pre-order bonus. Go to eeriecast.com/freak to pre-order and to fill out your pre-order verification. Mexico is very, very haunted. Indoors or outdoors, there seems to always be some sort of ghost or ghoul ready to turn your life into one long waking nightmare. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you can follow me on X, where I retweeted the most haunted painting in the world, known simply as Corey Borealis. Today's episode contains an assortment of scary stories of the unexplained, from Mexican folklore encounters to the most evil old folks ever heard of. Enjoy, and send me your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. If you can, leave Unexplained Encounters a rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts to help us reach more people to scare the crusty socks off of. Now, let's begin. A set of stories from Driver Appropriate 965. Lake Monster, El Chavarin. This story takes place in Mexico and has 3 parts. What I knew before hearing one of my uncle's stories, my uncle's story, and a legend I found later that is similar to what happened in my uncle's story, and to the events I heard about the lake, which leaves me thinking, because it seems like everything connects. From 2004 through 2007, when I was 13 through 16 years old, I lived in Mexico. The town I was living in, there's a lake on some hills where people go to have barbecues and hang out with family. One of the things that caught my eye was the white crosses all around the lake. On different occasions, I asked family and friends what the crosses were for, and they told me they were for the people who had drowned there. I was stunned. There were a lot of crosses. I thought that maybe they didn't know how to swim, or that the majority of people got drunk and went into the lake. But my cousins and friends told me stories that the people who drowned there were actually normal and sober. They were just going for a swim, and they drowned. Supposedly, some of them yelled out that something was pulling them under. I thought maybe they got caught in some plants underneath the water, drifting logs or something of the sort. But what was even weirder to me was that when I asked my aunts and uncles, they added more to those drowning people's stories, because apparently, not all the bodies could be recovered. This was also strange. The lake is kind of big, but not so big that people couldn't be found. There are 2 rivers that connect to the lake, one that flows into it, and another that flows out. There's a border dividing the latter from the lake. It's tall enough to prevent water from escaping, but people can go over it with ease. One of the stories of the drowning folk was that they were able to recover his body, but he was purple by the time they found him, with slash marks across his chest and his stomach. I was intrigued as to whether it was really true, or if people were simply trying to add on to all these lake incidents. Being a teenager, I couldn't go around asking questions. To be honest, I haven't remembered to ask when I visit now. That leads me to my uncle's story. After knowing I was asking a lot of questions about what was going on with the lake, my uncle told me something that happened to his friend when they were teenagers. He said that his friend had invited him to go fishing at night, because that's when fish are easier to catch, since they get close to the edge. My uncle said no because my grandma had grounded him at the time. Later that night, after midnight, my uncle heard banging on the door. The doors out there are made of metal, so it shook pretty bad. My grandma and uncle got up. My uncle went to the door and opened a little window to see who it was. It was his friend. He was wide-eyed and pale. My uncle asked him if he was all right and said that it looked like he had just seen a ghost. My grandma told him to bring his friend inside. They set him down, calmed him, and asked what exactly happened and where he'd been. He told them that he had ended up going to the lake alone on his bike with his gear, and he was going to camp out there, hoping to catch a bit of fish. After a couple of hours without any luck, he decided to leave. He was on the other side of the lake, so he had to go around. It was a bright night, so he was able to see the dirt road quite well. As he rode along the lake, he saw something coming out of the other side, where he was going to pass, but he didn't focus on it. After all, he assumed it was just a turtle or a big iguana that roam around those parts. The iguanas around there can grow up to 3 feet long and are dark instead of green. So he kept riding along, looking over to see this thing now coming out on all fours. He saw how its wet skin was shining in the moonlight. It had a reptilian tail, but it was short. The best he could describe it was like a stump of a tail, but it was pointy and very wide, almost as wide as its body. He couldn't tell if it had a neck. It just looked stocky from its upper body. He was just staring at how this huge lizard-looking thing had come out of the lake when, all of a sudden, he saw it stand up on its rear legs. That's when he got terrified, because on 2 legs, the thing was about 2 meters tall. He must have made a noise because the thing turned around and looked right at him. The thing had big red eyes. He could tell they were red from this distance, and he could tell they were big. He was about 20 meters away from it. He started to pedal harder with all his might because, to top this all off, the creature was downhill from the only road that led out of the lake. It was staring at him still, following him with its gaze. As soon as he was parallel to the creature, he gunned it down the road and did not look back at all until he made it to my grandma's house, which he chose to go to because it was closer than his house, maybe just 5 minutes away by bike. He stayed over that night and left the next day, still terrified. Town legend, El Chavarin. I came across this legend a few months after my uncle told me the previous story, and it left me stunned because it was too much of a coincidence with everything I'd heard by then. The legend takes place in Ameca, Jalisco, Mexico. It's about a fisherman named Lucio, who was struggling to provide for his family and supposedly made a deal with the devil. He found gold soon after, but became paranoid over time, thinking his family was just with him for the gold. Since the day he'd made the deal, he was always carrying around a snake. So one day he took his gold and his snake, and the people in the town saw him jump off a bridge into the river. He was never seen again. Legend has it, he was transformed into this lizard-like monster, big with scaly skin, large yellow eyes, and a small tail. He is said to be the cause of people drowning in that river and the waters that connect to the town's rivers. The town I was living in was only 30 minutes away from there. There was a duende living on my street. This story happened back in 2004, when my family and I moved from California to Mexico for personal reasons. We stayed in a house my parents had in the town they're from. Same time range as before. At the time, I'd gotten pretty close with my cousins. We started to have sleepovers. When it was their turn to come over to my house, we used to sleep in the living room right next to the stairs, which led to the second floor, which was cut off and under construction until my dad saved enough money to continue work on it. They had a long plastic skylight covering the top of the stairs, and right under it was where we used to set blankets to sleep. By this point, one of my cousins had already slept over a couple of times, and one morning, he asked me if we ever heard weird noises on the ceiling. He seemed serious, so I asked what he meant. "You guys don't hear like tapping on the roof sometimes?" He clarified. I told him, "That? Probably just birds tapping. You can see them doing it during the day." It was true. Birds had the habit of landing on the skylight, and we used to see their feet during the daytime. Then he replied, "No, I've seen and heard the birds you're talking about. This was a different kind of tapping." So I asked him to explain. He said, "Now don't get scared, but I heard tiny shoes, like if someone's running around. It sounds exactly like walking thumps, but smaller and lighter." I looked him straight in the face, couldn't hold back, and just burst out laughing. "No way, bro. We've been here a while now. We would have noticed anything like that. I mean, I kinda believe in that stuff, but there's no way it's happening here." He then had the idea to go to the roof to see if we could spot anything. Since it was only nighttime when he heard those thumps, I agreed to go ahead with him. We went and grabbed a ladder and got up on the roof. There was some dirt on the roof because the streets around us were dirt roads. Thanks to the dirt up there, I kid you not, we found tons of small footprints next to the skylight. I was amazed, asking him if he was messing with me. "How?" he said. "If we've been inside the house the entire time until now." That blew my mind. I put my hand next to the footprints. I'm telling you, they were smaller than my pinky, like an inch long and half an inch wide. It seemed like whatever it was had been going in circles close to the skylight. I saw the footprints go up to the skylight and walk away, but we could only follow the footprints on my roof because there wasn't sand or dirt everywhere. So after a distance from the skylight, we didn't know where it took off. I went back down and told my mom what we found, but she didn't believe us. I told her repeatedly to go up there to see it, but she just said maybe later. I got frustrated. We had a camera, but my parents always used to hide it from me, so that I wouldn't run the chance of breaking it. And I didn't have a phone with a camera, which probably wouldn't have helped because the quality on it was so bad. I thought of picking up part of the dirt where the footprint was, but it would likely disappear with movement because it was just a light layer of sand, really. I tried and I ended up dropping it, and my cousin and I just kept the story to ourselves. I never did hear the footsteps myself, and my parents ended up finishing the second floor. My cousin said he didn't hear any footsteps after that. Other stuff happened, but I'll save that for a different story. What did happen after this was that my mom made friends with the ladies around the block. One lady told my mom that there was in fact a duende, a mythical creature, living on the block, because things would be out of place in her home as if a child had been playing with them and didn't put things back where they go. She said that when one of her nieces went over, she claimed to see a tiny, scary-looking boy. We then found out that other people had the same or similar experiences. It reminded me of when my cousin and I saw the footprints. I came to the conclusion that it was the same thing, but I never experienced anything with a duende firsthand. La Llorona. This happened to me when I was 15. I went to Mexico during summer vacation to visit with my grandma and cousins. It was the rainy season, where my family's from, and my cousins always told me stories about La Llorona and how they hear her at night whenever it rains. I used to call bull because I heard that she only appears close to big bodies of water or rivers. The only water that used to pass through my grandma's area was this small stream. I've only seen it get big enough to go from sidewalk to sidewalk a couple of times. So I never believed that she could appear in something like that. I assumed they were just trying to scare me. One day we were out playing soccer, and after the game we all hung out for a bit. My cousin said that the night before he had heard La Llorona. But again, I just couldn't believe him. I mean, can you blame me? The guy was smiling the whole time he was telling us the story. I said to him, "How could she pass through your street if all there is a small stream of water?" And I laughed. He told us to sleep over that night, because it looked like it was going to keep raining that day. I agreed, and that night, it was him, 2 of his brothers, and me. We were watching movies, eating sandwiches, making fun of him, telling him that he was scared of the rain, because apparently his brothers didn't hear La Llorona. He had been the only one to supposedly hear it. I was like, "You're a scared fool," and laughed at him. As time passed, his youngest brother fell asleep. The rest of us were getting bored, and we asked him if he remembered around what time his girlfriend came the night before, laughing. He got serious and told us that it was around that time. My cousin and I, who were still awake, made chocolate milk and heard him say, "She's coming." We looked over at him. He was on the floor with a blanket all the way up to his neck, just looking at us wide-eyed. We could see real fear in his eyes, and we asked, "What's wrong, dude?" He said, "The animals are going to start fighting." And we were like, "What?" As soon as we reacted to his comment, the dog started barking out on the street, and my cousin got even more scared and began to shake, repeating, "She's coming, she's coming." He was getting on my nerves. I tried to pull the blanket off of him, but he was holding on to that blanket so hard. I then began to swing the blanket to make him get up, and he said, "The cats are going to start fighting right now." And the moment he finished that sentence, not a second later, we heard the cats fighting on the roof. My cousin and I were looking at each other like, what in the world? I could feel adrenaline kicking in. Then he said, "Now the cows are going to start up." And bam, same timing as before. I was in disbelief. I asked my other cousin to help me take off the blanket and stand him up. He just looked at us and said, "Now everything's going to go quiet at the same time." And of course, it happened just as he said. I asked him, "How did you know all that was going to happen?" He then freaked out and said, "Shh, she's coming." His brother was just next to me the whole time, looking around. We had noticed everything had gone quiet. We couldn't even hear crickets, not even the rain, nor white noise. It was just silent, like if someone had pressed the mute button on the world. My other cousin said, "You hear that?" And I asked, "What?" That's when I heard her. All 3 of us looked at each other wide-eyed, and I said, "No way." What we were hearing was a woman walking in the street, screaming. Not the famous, "Where are my kids?" but just a deep and loud lament, getting closer to the house. My adrenaline was at its peak then. I was so scared and excited at the same time. It was crazy. I told my other cousin to come with me to the window, since we'd heard her going away at that moment, but he was hesitant. I told him that nothing could happen to us since we were on the 2nd story. I said, "It's not like she's going to come up to the window." But he was like, "You idiot. If it is her, She's a freaking ghost. She could do anything she wants." I was flustered because I hadn't thought of it that way. But I didn't care what he said. I got close to the window with a dead stare at the curtains as I drew closer, just to see if I could catch a glimpse of a shadow or a silhouette on the other side. Just when I was a couple of feet away from the window, one of my cousins yelled at me, "Stop, you idiot!" He startled me, and fear finally took over. My adrenaline stopped. I ran back to the living room with my cousins, grabbing a sheet and sitting down. We just stayed there, talking quietly to each other until we finally dozed off. The next morning, we told my grandma and aunts about what we heard. They thought we were making things up. Later on, during a trip, my grandma sat next to me and told me that it was a good thing I didn't look out the window that night, because people say that when La Llorona sounds far, she's actually very, very close. I was horrified, but at the same time, it was a very cool and creepy experience to live through. Skinwalker and NOD's ghost during training in Arizona. From Reem 117. This story comes from my experience in the military, specifically from a certain training area in Arizona. I won't be too specific about where exactly I was, for obvious reasons, but the location isn't really important. It's what happened while we were there, and what I saw that I still think about to this day. For context, I was raised in a rural part of North Idaho, so the outdoors are very familiar to me. At first, training in the deserts of Arizona didn't sound too bad. I'd been in for a few years at that point, knew my way around, was a good soldier in my opinion, always doing my best to keep a level head. Our training started sometime around mid-October, when the air starts to get colder and wind plus rain affects you more than it usually does. If you know anything about the desert and temperatures, it can get very, very cold and fast at night. Even if it's 90 degrees out at lunchtime, it could hit well below 20 at night, and the wind and rain that usually accompanied it didn't help. The reason I specify the nighttime conditions is because that's the only time we were allowed to run our training and operations. We were testing equipment for the Army, but could not go out during the day because it had the potential to screw up communication between airplanes and such. So at night, when little to no aircraft were out, we would head out and begin our training. We started at 2100, 9 p.m., and ended missions at 0600, 6 a.m. That way we could sleep during the day and train again at night, sometimes multiple times in a row. Now, personally, I believe that there are creatures and entities on this planet that we can't really explain. Little did I know, I was about to have 2 encounters in a single night, one of them face to face. The first happened at about 2300. 3 other men and I were scanning a road and field to watch for OP4, or opposing force. They were played by other soldiers in different uniforms for training purposes, so we were on our guard. It was my job to watch the field and the road, while the other 2 made radio calls, waiting for the signal to move in further. I moved maybe 30 feet away from them to get a better spot for pulling security. I backed myself into a bush with some leaves still hanging to somewhat cover my position. On my left was a wide open field with a single tree in the middle, about 300 feet away from me. It only had 2 branches, both in very awkward positions for a tree. One was angled upwards, while the other one seemed to point straight out at the road. On my right, on the other side of the road I was watching, was a tree line which turned into a hill that we would be walking up later after we got the green light. As I scanned the field and the road for OP4 or vehicles, I spotted some headlights crest over a hill not too far away from us. They were easy to see with our night vision. You could see someone using any kind of light for miles, as if it wasn't already easy enough to see light at night. I raised my voice to tell the other 2 men that there was a vehicle coming and to tell everyone else to stay hidden. I pushed myself even further into the bush so that I would be completely concealed. The truck drove right past us. We had remained undetected. My heart was racing, excited to have stayed hidden and been so close. But what happened next made my heart sink. I looked back out at the road and field to see if there was anything else coming, and when my eyes crossed over to the field, the tree had moved. I rubbed my eyes and refocused my night vision to see if that would help. But the tree had, in fact, moved closer to me, and the branches had also moved. Both of its dead limbs now seemed to point at me. It was about 200 feet away from me. I convinced myself I was just seeing things. About 5 minutes later, I felt a tap on my shoulder, causing me to jump a bit. It was just my teammate. He said, "It's time to move up. You good?" I turned to face him when I said I was ready to go, but when I turned back to take one more look at the field, that tree was gone. I sat there on one knee in disbelief. To have hallucinated the tree's distance and shape was believable to me, but to have made up the tree entirely to myself, no way. A chill ran down my spine as I searched for the tree before cautiously emerging from my bush and walking back to my team. As I did, I constantly looked over my shoulder at that wide open field that was all of a sudden empty. This put me on edge for the rest of the night, and we still had not completed our objective. After another hour of walking through the woods and a couple of open fields, we finally arrived at the objective. The mission was a little tricky. We had to infiltrate a small mock village and secure an HVT, or high-value target. Only after all that could we call the mission complete. For context, all the Op-4 we were fighting were just other soldiers in uniform, all using blank rounds with lasers. This lets you train for a real-world fight without getting hurt. When you get hit by a laser, a beeping sound will come from equipment on our body armor, which means we were considered injured and had to play dead. Anyway, our front element was spotted by the Op-4, so we had to fight to take the village. It was both fun and intense, as after walking for hours not doing much, we finally got to train and work on other skills. My team was in charge of securing the HVT, so after we had eliminated the Op-4, my team and I moved to the building he was supposed to be in. The HVT was simply a soldier in a white robe that we had to capture in order to call the mission complete. When we finally got to the building, which was simply a one-room building with 2 large doors, I had one of my soldiers open the door so that I could peek inside. When he did, I saw a silhouette in the back of the room. I was about to yell and tell him to put his hands up, but something was wrong. This person was far too short. They had long black hair and what looked to be a black robe under our night vision. I hesitated, and this shadow person in the room broke into a sprint right at me. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I panicked, firing off 3 blank shots. When the smoke cleared, a yell came from inside the room. My adrenaline was pumping now more than ever, and I moved in, yelling as if I was trying to scare someone. I expected to see it again when I swung into the room, but when I looked, it was just the HVT, covering his ears because my shots had echoed, becoming very loud in that small space. I had trouble relaxing as my soldier came in after me, and without question began to search the man, pretending to detain him. The HVT had not seen the black figure that charged me. He had no idea what I was shooting at. We wrapped up the mission, leaving the field around 5:30 in the morning. As we drove away with the rising sun chasing away the desert's mirages and the mountain's shadows, I still could not shake the thought that what I had seen felt so real. Thankfully, that was the last mission we did out there, and I had trouble sleeping for days afterward. Needless to say, this confirmed my belief in the fact that there are things on this earth that are beyond our understanding right now, and I'm just thankful it didn't go down any worse. Willow-Brook Manor, from AmmeJeanRomeo. Just outside of our small town resides a large estate which has belonged to the same family for centuries. The story varies a bit upon whom you ask, but the name of the estate is Willow-Brook, named after the family who built it. It has been abandoned for about 10 years. However, the last Willow-Brook relatives that resided there had gained a bit of a reputation. Arthur and Maisie Willow-Brook, a couple in their 60s, had seen off their youngest child a few years back, and so took it upon themselves to start fostering kids. Only, the children seemed to come and go with alarming frequency. When Mrs. Willow-Brook was seen doing her weekly food shop at the local supermarket, she always seemed to have a different child in tow. They did go on to adopt one of the children, a 10-year-old boy named Timothy. Timothy's schoolmates would remark that he was a quiet and withdrawn boy, and when asked about his adoptive parents, he would immediately clam up. Strangely, he was the only child in their care that they allowed to attend school. Time passed and rumors grew. It was one early Friday morning that the sleepy atmosphere of the town was pierced by the wail of an ambulance siren as the vehicle rushed to the Willow-Brook residence. Neighbors gathered at the end of the street that led to the estate and watched on in horror as little Timothy was carried on a stretcher into the ambulance. His left leg had been severed below the knee. The paramedics hurriedly tried to stem the flow of blood. The little boy was out cold and was quickly shuttled into the ambulance. As the vehicle drove off, the residents all shared stunned glances and rumors flew. Rumors that little Timothy had been injured by one or both of his parents. Only no arrests were ever made, much to the surprise of the local newspapers. Timmy eventually came back to school, now in a wheelchair. If he had been a quiet boy before, he now looked downright haunted. The other children gave him a wide berth, and he spent most of his time on his own, not talking to anyone. The Willow-Brook couple were continuing to foster more children, and had just taken in a set of identical twin girls. No more than a couple of years old, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girls delighted the local residents when they were spotted out and about with their foster mother, their cute antics and sunny smiles bringing joy to the locals. Time passed, and they too soon disappeared from sight. When questioned about their location, the old couple merely shrugged and said that the girls had been taken away by their biological parents. Things took a turn when a local child went missing one day whilst on their way home from school. A blue car had been seen near the vicinity of where the missing little boy was last seen. But no arrests were made, and the child remained missing. The locals started pointing fingers at the Willow-Brooks, remarking that it was strange how the twin girls in their care had suddenly disappeared. Then, not long after, a local boy went missing. Mr. Willow-Brook scoffed at the accusations and told the nosy neighbors to mind their own business. Years passed by, and though it could be passed off as a coincidence due to the gaps between the abductions, 5 more local children disappeared over the span of 3 years. none of them were ever found. And it was a town-wide held belief that the Willowbrooks had something to do with these disappearances. Eventually, Mr. Willow-Brook passed away from some medical issues. His wife, Maisie, followed him a couple of years later. The Willow-Brook estate now stood vacant and had fallen into disrepair. Timothy was also nowhere to be found. The locals assumed he had been taken back into foster care or had aged out of it and was living elsewhere. In the time since, arrogant teenagers who had heard the stories dared each other to sneak into the old estate, searching for clues about the missing children. The estate consisted of a main house, 3 small outer annexes, a large expanse of grassland, and numerous heavily shaded trees surrounding the buildings. Most explorations proved fruitless, most kids being spooked by their own shadows and running away screaming. That was until my older brother and his friends all agreed to explore the abandoned estate one warm summer night. I'd begged to go along with them, but my brother told me I was too young. He didn't want to have to babysit his younger sister. Therefore, what I'm about to tell you comes from my brother's own mouth. My brother and 3 of his friends snuck through a hole in the wall of the brick structure that surrounded the estate. They moved silently, waiting to ensure no one had spotted them trespassing from outside. Despite the overgrown grass, it was a short walk to the main house. The house was 3 stories high, standing grand and tall despite the clear state of disrepair. They walked up the few steps to the entrance, and my brother pushed the large oak door. It creaked loudly, swinging slightly inwards. Fist-bumping each other for their stroke of luck, torches in hand, the 4 boys entered the house. Despite the light summer evening, the inside was dark and shaded. Bringing torches had been a good call. They explored each room one by one. The main entrance, living room, another sitting room, before finally entering the impressive kitchen. The walls were lined with numerous cupboards, many of the doors now cracked or hanging off. A large counter sat in the middle of the room, and a variety of pots, pans, and cutlery were scattered across it. Yet, it was none of these things that captured the boys' attention. As soon as they had entered the room, they were hit with a god-awful smell. My brother gagged and pulled the neck of his hoodie up over his nose and mouth. He flicked his eyes around the room, and they landed on the old-fashioned refrigerator. It was covered in layers of dirt and grime, and the door to it was cracked open. As he got closer, that vile smell grew stronger. He drew closer and reached out a tentative hand, pulling the fridge door open. The smell and sight before his eyes made him double over and retch. A human skull sat dead center on one of the shelves, its lower jaw missing. Old red and brown stains littered the inside of the fridge, and suspicious-looking containers sat scattered around it. My brother scrambled back and told his friends they needed to get the heck out of there. Knowing something was badly wrong due to the smell, they took him at his word. The 4 boys ran back through the house, tripping over furniture in their haste. It was only when crawling back through the hole in the wall that my brother finally took a breath and explained what he had seen. His friends looked at him in horror, debating whether to report their findings to the police. Having been trespassing, though, my brother was reluctant to do so. After much deliberating, my brother and his friends drove to a phone box far away from the house and made an anonymous report to the police. Soon after, the story blew up and police searched the estate from top to bottom. They uncovered the remains of more than 20 children on the property, 5 of which were confirmed to be the remains of the missing children. The town was shocked, outraged, and so they campaigned for the murder house to be demolished. Unfortunately, the authorities have not been able to track down any living Willow-Brook relatives, and so they are unwilling to demolish the house without consulting remaining family first. Though the police have never confirmed the details of the children's deaths, it is believed that Maisie and Arthur were cannibals, and they preyed on the weak. These seemingly caring individuals invited innocent children into their home, only to gruesomely end their lives. Now the truth has come to light. Our seemingly idyllic little town will never be the same again. Road Trip Nightmare from AutumnHopeArt. I spent my early 20s traveling a ton. I worked part-time with an imported car company that did shows all over the South. Several times a year, I would drive from Florida to Kentucky, Tennessee to Georgia, all over the place. Often on these trips, I would end up taking some strange country or county road to avoid highways early in the morning. The worst drive of my life, 3 things happened that I still can't explain. The first happened around 1 a.m. My GPS told me to take the most sudden exit onto a side road off the interstate. It was nothing but farmland and trees, but my GPS swore it was a shortcut. I was cruising for 5 minutes or so when an old Mustang pulled up behind me, flashing their lights. They rode my bumper for about 15 minutes, but there was nowhere to pull off in the middle of the countryside. They revved up, and I thought they were going to finally pass me, being as there was no oncoming traffic. We were the only ones on the road for miles, but the car never passed me. I physically turned my head to check my blind spot, but the car was gone. There was no turnoff or area for them to have pulled over. It just straight up disappeared. When I got back on the interstate, 30 minutes had passed, but I was right back at the same exit I'd taken to get off. I'd been on a long, straight, dark road for half an hour and ended up exactly where I'd started. A couple of hours passed. I was now 10 hours into my drive and only 2 hours from my home. I turned off the interstate onto a county road that led to the highway my house was on. It was a local shortcut I'd taken many times before, only about 2 cities over from my own. It was a little after 3 a.m. I went for a cigarette to keep me awake for the last leg of the ride, and my lighter ran out. As I was about to put the cigarette back in the pack, I passed a poorly lit gas station. Perfect. I pulled into the parking lot and decided to fill up. While I was at the pump, I noticed inside there were 2 people, an old meemaw-looking woman in a muumuu at the register, and a big ol' redneck fella in overalls in the aisle. They were facing each other like they were in a conversation, but neither of them was moving. I made my way cautiously inside, approaching the register looking for a big lighter. I didn't see any, so I asked the woman at the front if she had any. She looked at me like I was from Mars. I tried to explain I just wanted a lighter for my cigarettes, and she goes, "Oh, I have matches if that's what you're looking for." She handed me a box of matches and didn't charge me for them. I thanked her and turned to leave when I realized the man in the overalls still hadn't moved, but I could feel him watching me. I was 19 or 20 years old, 125 pounds soaking wet at this point of my life. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up, and my brain was yelling at me to get the heck out of there. I quickly got back to my car, and the exact moment I turned on the engine, every light in that gas station went off. Inside, outside, the pumps, the streetlight, it was pitch black, except for my headlights. My tires squealed as I tore out of the parking lot so fast. I kept that box of matches for years to solidify in my mind that the experience actually happened. Every time I went back on that county road, I searched for that gas station, but I'm 100% truthful when I say I never found it again. At this point, I was not 45 minutes away from the state line and an hour from my comfy bed. I was freaked out and beyond exhausted. I'd been up for 2 days and could go cross-eyed from staring at the road for so long. I was still on the same road, but a long way from that gas station, and I was still trying to put it out of my mind, when, all of a sudden, I saw blue lights behind me. Now, my father had been a police officer for 26 years. I remember the year police cars went from the old school rotating lights to the new LED bar lights. This hellacious road trip was probably around 2016. Yet, behind me were those old-school rotating lights. It was too dark to see what kind of car they sat on. All I really saw was blue. Luckily, I had a friend who was a sheriff's deputy a couple of cities over. So I called him, knowing he worked night shifts and would still be awake. I asked him if he knew of any departments that still used those old lights. He told me no one in the entire state still had them. So he told me to keep driving until I saw a public spot to pull over, but absolutely do not stop on the dark side of the road. So I drove for a solid 30 minutes, keeping my friend on the phone with me, the blue lights trailing behind me the whole way. I finally hit the crossroad where the county road meets the highway. I was almost 20 minutes from my house. I pulled into a very well-lit gas station at the intersection, a gas station that I stopped at almost daily on my way to work and felt very comfortable at. The blue lights behind me suddenly cut out, and the car sped off too fast for me to get the license plate or a good description. I went inside the gas station, bought a Red Bull and a pack of smokes from the little lady at the gas station, whose familiar face and friendly smile felt like a warm welcome back to reality. I got home that morning and checked all my doors several times before falling asleep. Soon after, I quit traveling with the car show. To this day, I hate driving by myself. I always bring a friend or my dog on long road trips. And no matter what the GPS says, I stay on the highways and the interstates. I've only told this story to 2 or 3 people over the years, in fear of folks not believing me. I still swear up and down I fell into some kind of time warp, maybe even the Twilight Zone itself. I'm now married to my police officer friend, and he very clearly remembers that night, as he was on the phone with me several times throughout it. But we've only talked about it once. The Thing. From michaelT. I'll be telling this story from my friend's point of view. His name is Mark. He was born in California and lived in the state for about 2 years. This is how Mark tells the story. My mother treated me differently because she thought I was different from the rest of my siblings. She would always argue with my dad at night, where I would hear her say, "Nathan, I don't know what to do with Mark. He acts so different from the rest of them." I had 3 siblings, Lisa, Alan, and Kendrick. I was the oldest, of course, but my mother thought that military school would help. However, my father said otherwise. He told my mom that I should go to Grandma's house and help her around the place. I didn't know much about my grandpa because he died when I was only 2. When the day came, I packed up my things, such as clothes and a lunchbox, containing nothing more than apple juice and a sandwich, and put it all in my backpack, which I stuck in the trunk. Just like that, we were off and onto the road. Now, my grandma lived in Chicago, and we were in California, so the drive would take about 38 hours and 5 minutes. Now that's a long drive, but we got there safe and sound, in that beautiful Toyota Corolla Cross, a pretty cool SUV if you ask me. When we got to Grandma and Grandpa's house, the home was about 50 years old. The stairs in the place looked like they might cave in at any moment, but they never did. However, it would creak, and there was this old doorbell with a Ring camera. I rang it, and I heard shuffling on the other side of the door. Then it opened. There stood a very old woman, my grandma. She was frail and disheveled, and she had long strands of gray hair hung in a bun. She said, "Hello, Rick. Long time since I've seen you. Last I saw you, you were about a year old." She pulled me into a hug and said to my dad, "Hello, Nathan. How are you doing?" My father replied, "I'm good, Mom. Just dropping Rick off." Grandma took me to the room where I would sleep. Of course, it was the attic, and it was dark. Lots of cobwebs, some of them hanging down from the ceiling. But it was just right for the night. My dad filled my grandma in on the things that were happening at home. Then my grandma looked sad and said, "Okay, Nathan. Thank you for bringing him. I really appreciate you driving all the way out here." After a heartfelt goodbye, my father left me in the care of my grandma. Over the weeks, I helped her clean up the yard. Once daily yard cleanup was done, I would have some free time on the PC, which was up in the attic with me. It was my uncle's, but he died at the young age of 21 due to a car accident. I remember one day I was playing some games when I remembered I needed to take the trash out. So I went downstairs, prepared the trash, and I was about to walk out the door. But my grandma suddenly stopped me. She told me something. "Never go into those woods, okay?" I nodded. After taking the trash out, I was about to go back in when I began to hear these shuffling sounds in the woods to my right. It sounded like something out there was trying to get my attention. I looked in that direction but didn't really see anything, so I brushed it off, thinking it was my imagination. I kept walking up the stairs to go back in when I heard the sound again. This time, it was followed by a crashing boom-bam. I whipped around to see the most disturbing sight I'd ever seen. It happened so fast. This malnourished-looking, leathery-skinned white creature darted out from behind the house. Its ribs were protruding from its side, and it had these huge hands, fingers elongated, ending with long black nails. Its legs were bent backward, more like a dog's or a goat's. It was just as disgusting as it was horrifying. It ran off as if it was twitching in pain, like some sort of deformed, injured baby kangaroo struggling to jump and kick at the same time. It disappeared, and after that, I ran back inside like a bat out of heck, while my grandma looked at me worried. I eventually told her what I saw, and not a week after that, she sent me back home. My grandma would pass away a few years later from a heart attack. It was sad, but I couldn't help but think about something. She'd been found outside, having just taken the trash out. Was the heart attack random, or did she see the same thing I saw, causing the heart attack? I can feel it in my bones. That thing was the reason. After this quick but disturbing experience, every night when I'm in bed, I always have something next to me to protect myself with. A Creature Near the Creek, from OnlyJEREMY. I was 8 years old and really dumb. I also didn't know how to swim until I was 13. It was a hot summer. My brother and I were at the creek near the woods. I was in the shallow part, which was about 2 feet, but in the deeper portions, this creek was more like a pond, also because it didn't really move much. My family calls it a creek though, I guess because it's near the woods and small, but at its deepest, it's about 6 feet. I was getting bored and was getting out of the creek. As I was reaching for my clothes, I saw something. It was pale, and I kid you not, it was about 7 feet tall. Back then, my brother, who was 16, was 5'3". Suddenly, this creature jumped right into the creek and swam towards my brother. My brother was on the bank near the deep end. he called out, "Hey Jer, watch this!" He jumped in, spinning at the same time, then landed in the water. I waited for him to come back up, terrified that that creature that had swam towards him would get him. After several moments, he did not come up out of the water. By the 3-minute mark, I was getting so worried and scared, I ran to my dad and told him what happened. Dad and Mom and I ran out, and to our surprise, there my brother was out of the water. He was confused. "Everything all right?" he said. I asked if he was all right. "What do you mean?" he replied. "I've been right here for the last 15 minutes. I was shocked. Only moments ago I saw him dive in and not come up. He was under long enough to have drowned. The creek is small enough I would have seen him come up if he had. I couldn't explain it, and I had no idea what that creature was or how it was connected to this confusion. Around 11:30 p.m., past bedtime, I was restless, thinking of what had happened. I looked over at my brother. He was just standing on his bed. I asked him, "What are you doing?" He didn't respond. I got out of bed and walked up to him. Finally, he spoke. "There's something outside the window." I was immediately scared. Remember, I'm only 8 years old at that point. He jumped from his bed onto the floor and opened the window, and I saw him crawl out the window and run away from the house. Terrified and once again confused, I followed him out. We then saw that same creature from earlier in the water peeping at us. We ran away, crawling back through the window and shutting it. Thankfully, we would later move out of that house. I wish I could tell whoever lives there now, beware of that thing by the creek. The Streetlight Man, from ChloeL. This story happened around 2 to 3 months ago. I'm going to keep the location private for reasons, but it's near Sacramento, California. I was hanging out with my best friend Kira. It was around 9 o'clock, and we were getting very bored by then. But we didn't have much money to go to the store nearby. Instead, we just decided to go for a walk outside. At first, it was pretty nice and calming, but it would take a turn. Each of us had a flashlight. We decided to take a pit stop at the park near her house. Her mom wasn't home at the time, just her brother. After leaving the park, I began to get this weird gut feeling, like we were in danger. My friend told me she was feeling kind of odd too, but we just kept walking. It was really cold outside at the time, and the part we were walking on was wet too, as it had been raining earlier. We then walked past this house with a cat statue outside. I stopped for a minute, because I could have sworn I saw it move its head at me. Kira got a little nervous, so we started to rush back home. We were only about 5 minutes away from her house. At the end of the street, there was a streetlight and palm trees going down the road. Around 15 feet back or so, we heard slight crunching sounds, like someone stepping on twigs. We tried to ignore it, but we were definitely on high alert. Eventually, I did look back, and I saw a man who was now standing under the streetlight. He was dressed entirely in black. This freaks out my best friend. We both look at each other and start running full speed back to my house. As I said before, it was wet, and we were slipping and sliding the whole way. The disturbing part was, the moment we began to run, I turned around because I heard something. Well, turns out, the man in all black began to chase after us. We were only a couple minutes away from her house, but the door was locked, and at the time her brother was playing video games and would not be able to hear us very well. We ran up to the door, banging and screaming loudly. Right on time, her brother opens up the door, letting us in. We caught our breaths, and we tell him what happened. Not sure if he believed us, but he did stay cautious, keeping an eye on the windows and doors. We all hid away in his room waiting for her mom to get home. Not sure if this was paranormal or just a very creepy guy. But why would he chase us down like that? And what would he have done if he had caught us? Thank you for listening to Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoy this show, think about supporting us. There are several ways you can. Search for EerieCast on your favorite podcast app and follow our other scary shows, especially the other two I host, Tales from the Break Room and Camping Horrors. Leave Unexplained Encounters a rating on Spotify and a review on Apple Podcasts. The more we get, the higher we climb in the charts. Get some cool merch at EerieCast.store, or unlock tons of cool extras like exclusive audiobooks and music tracks, ad-free access to all our shows, and a huge 20% discount on all our merch, all for less than $3 a month by signing up for EerieCast Plus at EerieCast.com/plus. Thank you. Until next time, send me your scariest stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org so I can narrate them in a future episode. And follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at Prevails for plenty of screams and memes. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.